My son said I was too old, too slow, and too much of a burden. So, he put me in a nursing home without my consent and moved into my house like I were already dead. But I wasn't confused. I wasn't finished. And while he thought I'd fade away quietly, I was planning something else, something he'd feel every time he opened his front door. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. That sentence, his sentence, split my life into a before and after. It was said at my own dining table on a Tuesday evening that had started like countless others. The roast chicken cooling on the counter, the clink of glasses, the steady hum of the refrigerator, familiar noises of a home built with sacrifice, and then Daniel's voice, calm, steady, rehearsed, cut through the air. "Mom, you're becoming a burden." The fork slipped from my hand and struck the plate with a sound sharper than I expected. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, reached out quickly, covering his words with hers, her smile as polished as glass. "He doesn't mean it like that, Margaret. We just worry. It's too much house for you now, too many bills, too much responsibility. You should rest." But Daniel didn't flinch. His eyes stayed fixed on mine, unblinking. He wanted the words to land. He wanted me to hear them exactly as he meant. I thought of every night I had scrubbed his clothes by hand because the washing machine had broken and there was no money for repair. I thought of the meals I had skipped so he could eat meat before a big exam. I thought of the day I pawned my wedding ring to buy him a suit for graduation, watching him walk across the stage with pride stitched into every seam I couldn't afford. I didn't ask for gratitude then, and I wasn't asking for it now, but I had believed in an unspoken covenant, that love would circle back, that the years I poured into him would not be weighed as debt. Instead, he sat across from me, his wife nodding in quiet agreement, and called me unnecessary. The conversation after was a blur. Words like safety, care, and best interest swirled in the room, each one polished to sound merciful but heavy with intent. They spoke of placement, of transition, of professional help. Every phrase was a cushion around a blow, every sentence a velvet glove over a closed fist. I remember Vanessa sliding a pamphlet across the table, her nails painted a pale pink, tapping lightly on the glossy cover of Maple Grove Senior Living. "It's beautiful, Margaret. Look, gardens, recreation, even art classes. You'll love it there." I didn't pick it up. My hands stayed folded in my lap, the muscles tightening with each word. 2 days later, they insisted on taking me to lunch. "Just the three of us," Daniel said, like it was a gift. I didn't wear my good shoes. I didn't pack a bag, because in my mind, this was still lunch. Mothers don't expect betrayal in daylight. But the car ride was silent, except for the sound of tires grinding against asphalt. And when the car slowed, it wasn't outside a restaurant. It was in front of a low, sprawling building with beige walls and a row of artificial flowers in plastic planters. Maple Grove Senior Living. "Just for a little while," Daniel said, his hand briefly squeezing mine. "Rest up. You need this." Vanessa leaned in, her lips brushing my cheek, her voice coated in sweetness. "It's for your own good." The doors closed behind me before I realized what had happened. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and lemon cleaner. The nurse guided me down a hall lined with faded paintings of gardens no one could visit, toward a room that looked like every other room. A twin bed, a single dresser, and a window with a thin curtain that shifted faintly in the breeze from a vent. No family photographs, no books, no traces of me. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the curtain. It moved as if someone invisible had touched it, a reminder that air still passed through, but no warmth. I asked to call my son to confirm this was temporary, to hear his voice say the words again, so I could believe they weren't final. The nurse hesitated, then brought me a folder instead. "Everything's in here," she said gently. I opened it with trembling fingers. Pages of medical consent, residential admission, and observation status. Each line is filled neatly. My name typed across the top, my birth date, my address. At the bottom, a signature, mine. But it wasn't mine. I knew the slope of my own handwriting, the way the M in Margaret always leaned left, the sharp curve of the H in Hayes. This was not my hand. This was a forgery, written confidently, as if the one holding the pen believed no one would ever question it. The room spun quietly around me. I gripped the paper so tightly that the edge cut into my palm. The nurse touched my shoulder. "Your son said you signed. He has power of attorney." My voice came out low, measured. "I never gave him that." But the nurse only looked at me the way people look at the elderly when they think denial is confusion. Pity softened her face, but it burned mine. I sat there, on that bed I had not chosen, in a room that was not mine, watching the curtain move with the faint draft of air conditioning. My name had been stolen, my house occupied, my dignity placed in a file folder. I was not confused, I was not finished. And as the camera of memory would have it, if someone were watching, they would have seen the frame close slowly on my eyes, dry, cold, unblinking. The betrayal had been delivered softly, disguised as care. And that is how I learned that sometimes the deepest wounds arrive with the gentlest hands. I remember the first morning I woke up in that narrow bed with the plastic headboard and the curtain that swayed like a ghost against the window pane. The air felt different. It was sterile, not the kind of cold you get from a draft, but the cold of something stripped of home. I lay there, listening to the shuffling of feet down the hall and the hollow click of a cart being pushed by some young aide, and I thought about how much of my life had been spent in kitchens and laundries, not in beds like this. My body remembered the rhythm of sacrifice more than it remembered the rhythm of sleep. It came to me in a rush, that sharp contrast between then and now. Then was standing over a sink full of dishes, working shifts at the grocery store, cleaning houses for neighbors who would later smile politely at Daniel's graduation and remark on how smart he was. They didn't know I had sold my wedding band to buy that suit, the one with the neat lapels and the crisp tie, the one that made him look like he belonged in a world we couldn't afford. I didn't tell him either. I just slipped the band off my finger one afternoon, walked into a pawn shop that smelled of tobacco and disappointment, and let the clerk weigh my marriage on a scale. He counted out bills that didn't even match half the worth of the love it had symbolized, but I folded them anyway and walked out lighter, ringless, but still determined. That was who I was. A woman who carried, who endured, who gave without waiting for receipts of gratitude. And now that same son, whose head once rested on my shoulder when fevers made him sweat through his sheets, had placed me in a home without my consent. He had measured my worth as a burden, not a blessing. The nurse stopped by later that morning, a clipboard tucked under her arm. She checked the chart clipped to the end of the bed, her eyes scanning as if my life could be reduced to blood pressure numbers and medication notes. She glanced at me, her smile polite but distant. "Your son said you're not safe on your own. He told us to expect some confusion spells." I looked at her, wanting to shout, wanting to remind her that the only confusion in this room was the lie written in neat pen strokes on forged documents. But I held my tongue. To shout would be to confirm their suspicion. Instead, I said, "My voice even, I cooked my own meals last week. I paid my bills. I was working in the garden when he came by. That isn't confusion. That's living." Her expression didn't change. She nodded, as though humoring me, and marked something down on the chart. When she left, I sat back on the bed and stared at the curtain. Its movement was the only honest thing in that room. That afternoon, the silence pressed on me. Silence in a house can be comforting, a pause between the tick of clocks and the hum of an old refrigerator. Silence here was different. It was heavy. It told me I no longer belonged to myself. I closed my eyes and let memory wash in. I remembered Daniel at 8 years old, his sneakers too tight, the way he sat on the porch steps holding his knees to his chest because the other boys had teased him for wearing hand-me-down shoes. I had gone back inside, lifted a mason jar from the cupboard where I hid crumpled bills and loose change, and emptied it onto the table. I counted slowly, coins slipping through my fingers, until I had enough to buy him a new pair. The look on his face when I laced those shoes onto his feet still lives in me. It was pure gratitude, pure joy. I had thought then that this was enough, that my sacrifice had been seen, felt, but the arc of love bends in strange ways. Sometimes it bends back toward you, and sometimes it folds away, out of reach. The next day, a letter came addressed to me, but when the nurse handed it over, I noticed the envelope was already opened, the edges roughly torn. Inside was a utility statement. My eyes scanned it, expecting to see my name, the familiar letters that had always been mine, but it wasn't there. The account holder was listed as Daniel Hayes. My name had vanished, erased as cleanly as chalk from a board. My hands trembled, the paper rattling like a confession. I asked the nurse about it, and she frowned, tilting her head. "Perhaps your son updated things for you. It's easier that way." Easier for whom, I wanted to ask. Easier for him to inherit what isn't yet his? Easier for them to fold my life into his hands like a file transferred between departments? I folded the statement and tucked it into the pocket of my cardigan. Evidence. That night, sleep didn't come. I lay awake listening to the moans and half-formed words of other residents drifting through the hall, and I felt a tremor of fear. Was this how they meant me to end? Surrounded by voices that had forgotten their names, erased like my own from the utility bill? My hand went instinctively to my bare ring finger. The absence of the ring had always been a reminder of the price of sacrifice, but now it burned as something else. Proof. I had given everything, and in return, I was disposable. On the third day, a neighbor's son visited one of the residents. I caught sight of him through the hallway window. He waved politely, hesitated, then came closer to the glass. "Mrs. Hayes," he mouthed, his voice muffled by the pain. I nodded. He raised his phone, then slipped away. Hours later, one of the aides brought me another envelope. Inside was a note scribbled in hurried handwriting. "They've changed your locks. I saw Vanessa directing the locksmith yesterday. I'm sorry." The words blurred before me. Changed the locks. My home was no longer mine, even in name. They had closed the door to the life I built and tossed the key into their pockets. I folded the note, pressed it flat, and slid it into the same pocket as the utility bill. My evidence was growing. When the nurse came in that evening to check vitals, she offered the same practiced reassurance. "Your son said you need to rest, Margaret, that you worry too much." I smiled faintly, because worry is the first cousin of love. I had worried over Daniel his whole life, worried him into college, worried him into shoes that fit, worried him into every warm meal. But now my worry was sharpening. It was no longer maternal. It was strategic. After she left, I sat by the small table near the window, the curtain brushing lightly against my arm. I pulled a notebook from the drawer, the kind meant for crosswords and afternoon doodles, and opened it to a blank page. My hand hesitated only a moment before the pen touched paper. I wrote, May 12, Daniel and Vanessa drove me to Maple Grove. I did not consent. Admission papers bear a false signature. May 13, utility bill arrives. My name has been removed. Daniel is listed as the account holder. May 14, note from neighbor's son. Locks changed on Elm Street house. Witness, his name. I looked at the words forming under my pen. Steady, sharp. They were not just notes. They were memories turning into evidence. Proof that what was being done to me was not love, not care, not mercy. It was theft dressed as duty. I closed the notebook slowly, pressing the cover with both hands as if sealing a promise. The curtain shifted again in the quiet breeze, and I felt its movement against my skin like the brush of a hand, reminding me I was still here. The betrayal had already been written into my days, but now, so was my record of it. The silence of those walls would not erase me. It would witness me, and in that silence, I began. The first time I asked for a notebook, the nurse thought I wanted to do crosswords. She smiled kindly, the way people do when they believe they are humoring someone fragile, and said she would see what she could find in the activities closet. I didn't correct her. I didn't tell her that the kind of puzzle I was about to work out had nothing to do with words intersecting in neat little grids. Mine was a puzzle of dates, accounts, signatures, and betrayals. When she returned, she placed a small, spiral-bound notebook on the table beside my bed. The cover was thin cardboard, decorated with faded blue flowers. The kind of cheap design you see in dollar stores is stacked high in bins. She also left a pen, one of those translucent click pens with barely any ink left in it. I picked it up, rolled it between my fingers, and felt how light it was, almost weightless, as though it might disappear if I didn't hold tight. I turned to the first blank page. For a moment, I just stared at it. A clean page has a way of reflecting your hesitation. It waits. It dares you. My hand trembled, but not from weakness. Trembling can come from adrenaline too, from the kind of resolve that makes your body aware of how much every line matters. I leaned close and whispered to myself. I wasn't confused. I was preparing. Then I began. The first entry was simple. May 12. Daniel and Vanessa drove me here under the guise of lunch. I did not consent. Admission papers bear my name, but the signature is false. The next line came faster. May 13. The utility bill arrived. Account holder listed as Daniel Hayes. My name has been removed. Then May 14. Note from neighbor's son. Witnessed Vanessa changing the locks on the Elm Street house. I paused, lifted the pen, and pressed my thumb over the ink I had just written, as though testing whether it would smear, whether the truth could be smudged away like wet paint, but the ink held. It sank into the paper and became permanent. That gave me courage. I flipped back through the clutter of my mind, gathering fragments, shaping them into something that resembled order. I wrote about the pawn shop, the day I let go of my wedding band for Daniel's graduation suit. I described the shop's neon sign, the glass counter smudged with fingerprints, the way the clerk looked at me without recognition, as if my sacrifice was nothing more than a transaction. I wrote about Daniel's smile that day when he tried on the suit, how it fit him like a promise, how he never knew what it cost. I wrote it all down because memory is fragile, but ink holds. Each line I added steadied me. The page filled with names of neighbors who had seen Daniel's car in my driveway at odd hours, with numbers from bank statements I still remembered, with dates of conversations where words like burden and safe and best interest had been wielded like weapons. What had once been whispers in my head now became testimony on paper. The pacing of my writing shifted. At first, each sentence came slowly, deliberately, my hand tracing careful shapes like a child learning to write again. But as the hours passed, speed took over. The pen scratched faster, my thoughts pushing each other forward, tumbling onto the page before I could lose them. I was no longer documenting. I was strategizing. The notebook was becoming a blueprint. By evening, I had filled nearly 10 pages. My hand ached, but it was the good kind of ache, the ache of muscles used with purpose. I set the pen down, flexed my fingers, and stared at the pages. I realized what I held wasn't just a record, it was evidence. It was the beginning of my return. That night, I opened the drawer of the nightstand where the facility kept personal items for residents. I searched until my hand brushed against the edges of an old address book I had carried for years, though I hadn't looked at it in some time. The leather cover was worn soft, the corners frayed. I flipped it open, my eyes moving down the alphabetized tabs until they landed on the letter R, Reeves, Monica, a name I hadn't spoken in nearly 2 years. I remembered the first time I had met her. My mother had left a small trust, nothing grand, but enough to need legal guidance. Monica had been sharp, precise, a woman who spoke with the authority of someone who had long stopped asking for permission. I had trusted her then. She had told me once, "You don't always need to use the law loudly. Sometimes you just need to use it correctly." Seeing her name again in my book, written in my own handwriting, felt like finding a lifeline coiled at the bottom of a well. I traced the number with my fingertip, whispering it as if saying it aloud might keep it alive. The twist was not just that I still had her number, it was that I still had the presence of mind to know I needed it. Daniel and Vanessa might have convinced themselves I was slipping, that I was fading, that confusion was creeping in like ivy up the walls. But here I was, remembering, recording, retrieving. Every stroke of the pen, every number copied into the notebook, was proof that I was not disappearing. The next morning, I added her to my notes. May 15, found the address book. Contact: Monica Reeves, attorney. Last consulted in 2019. Trusted. I closed the notebook and set it carefully on the nightstand. It felt heavier now, as if each word had weight, as if it could tilt the balance back toward me. That day, the nurse came in again, her clipboard in hand. She smiled that same soft smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "How are you feeling today, Margaret?" I met her gaze and answered plainly. Focused. She blinked, perhaps not expecting that word, and marked something on the chart. Later, when she adjusted the blanket, she glanced at the notebook. "That for journaling?" "Yes," I said evenly. "For clarity." She nodded, satisfied, and left. She didn't need to know clarity meant more than she assumed. When the hallway quieted that night, I pulled the notebook closer. I opened it and reread everything I had written. The ink stood sharp against the paper. I whispered again to myself, not as a confession, but as an affirmation. I wasn't confused. I was preparing. The clock down the hall chimed softly, its echo traveling through the sterile corridors. Each tick felt like a drumbeat, a reminder that time was not theirs to steal. Time belonged to me, and I was using it. I sat back, letting the sound settle in my bones, and felt something stir inside me that I hadn't felt in weeks, resolve. The silence of the facility had tried to swallow me whole. But in that silence, I had found a new voice, one that scratched across paper in lines and evidence and truth. The betrayal had been written into my days, but now, so was my record of it. And in that notebook, my revenge had begun. The day I decided to call Monica Reeves, the air in that room felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were leaning closer, waiting to hear what I would do. The curtain by the window swayed slightly with the vent's current, and I took it as a sign. I had filled pages of my notebook with dates, transactions, and every suspicious detail I could gather, but paper alone would not lift me from this place. I needed a voice stronger than mine to carry it beyond these beige walls. I pulled the old address book from the drawer, the one with its leather worn thin, and dialed the number with deliberate precision. The phone felt heavier with each digit. When the line clicked, I heard the hollow emptiness of voicemail. My mouth went dry, but I steadied myself. "This is Margaret Hayes. My son committed fraud under my name. He admitted me here without my consent. I still have access to documents, accounts, and proof. Call me back." The words came out calm, each one shaped like stone. I hung up, my finger lingering on the button as though pressing harder could make her hear it faster. Then silence returned, a silence thick with waiting. Minutes stretched into hours, each one broken only by the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum outside my door. My mind ran in circles. Would she remember me after so long? Would she believe me? Or would she think I was just another old woman clutching at stories to feel less powerless? I wrote the time of the call in my notebook, 11:07 a.m., May 15. Then I sat by the window and watched the cars come and go from the parking lot, each one carrying a different possibility. By mid-afternoon, the phone on the wall buzzed. The nurse answered, then held the receiver toward me. "For you," she said, almost surprised. I pressed the phone to my ear and heard a voice that carried both authority and urgency. "Margaret? This is Monica Reeves. Are you safe?" Her words almost undid me, but I kept my voice level. As safe as a woman can be when her only child signs her away like a piece of luggage. She was silent for a moment, then said firmly, "Tell me everything." So I did. I told her about the forged signature, the utility bill stripped of my name, the neighbor who witnessed Vanessa changing the locks. I described how they had called me a burden, how they had smiled while erasing me. Her breath sharpened over the line. "I'm coming," she said. "Expect me by evening." The relief that washed through me was not noisy. It was quiet, steady, like water reaching parched soil. I wrote down the time again in my notebook, 2:46 p.m., Monica confirmed visit. The wait until evening was unbearable. My pacing shifted into something restless, my thoughts moving faster than my body. Every sound in the hallway startled me. Every set of footsteps made me look up, hoping it was her. When she finally arrived, it was not with fanfare but with a purposeful stride. I saw her through the glass panel of the door before she even entered. Tall, silver hair pinned neatly back, glasses glinting under fluorescent lights, and in her hand a briefcase that looked too heavy for its size. She did not smile politely like the nurses. She did not soften her expression into pity. She walked in, placed the briefcase firmly on the table with a thud that echoed against the walls, and looked me straight in the eye. "You're not staying here another week." The words settled over me like armor. The administrator appeared within minutes, summoned by the tension radiating from Monica's presence. He tried to explain, using words like policy and best interest, his hands fidgeting with the edges of his clipboard. Monica opened the briefcase, pulled out a stack of papers, and laid them down one by one as if dealing cards in a game he was destined to lose. Here is her original will, signed and notarized, with no mention of power of attorney. Here are her bank statements showing continued independent management of funds. Here is testimony from a medical professional confirming she is mentally competent. And here, Monica tapped the page, is my filing for an emergency motion to revoke any forged authority. The administrator's face paled. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as a patient, but as a person with rights. Monica's voice cut through his silence. "If you do not release her, you will be facing liability. Choose carefully." For the first time since Daniel had left me in this place, I felt the ground shift back beneath my feet. The staff who had looked at me with indulgent smiles now looked at me with unease, as though realizing they had underestimated the wrong woman. I glanced at my notebook on the nightstand, pages filled with dates and details, and knew that every word I had written had brought me to this moment. The nurse who had told me gently that I wasn't safe on my own came in later, her tone different now. She adjusted my blanket and whispered almost apologetically, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes. We only followed instructions." I met her eyes. Sometimes instructions are wrong. By the next morning, Monica had arranged a temporary discharge pending court review. It wasn't freedom wrapped in ribbon, but it was a door opening. A door that had been slammed shut by my own son now creaked on its hinges. When I packed the few belongings I had in that room, a sweater, a photograph of my husband, and the notebook, I felt the curtain brush against my arm one last time. It moved as if waving me onward. Monica walked beside me down the corridor. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second a reminder that time had not abandoned me. The staff's eyes followed us, a mixture of surprise, relief, and unease. We reached the front doors. Monica pushed them open, and I stepped into the evening air. The sky was streaked with the last light of day, gold fading into blue. I breathed deeply, the air crisp, alive. The camera of memory would have caught our steps leaving the building, the briefcase swinging slightly in Monica's hand, my own notebook pressed against my chest. Justice had not been won yet, but it had been called by name, and that is how it begins. The morning after Monica arrived, I woke before the first cart rattled past my door. The air had that flat chill that belongs to rooms where nothing personal is allowed to linger. I sat up slowly and looked at the notebook on the nightstand. The pages lay steady. The words I had written the night before were not going anywhere. I pressed my palm over the cover the way someone might calm a heartbeat. Then I stood and waited for footsteps I could trust. They came in a clipped rhythm and stopped in my doorway. Monica did not ask if I had slept. She looked at the clock on the wall and said, "We move now." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. She had the authority of a woman who has carried many people through doors they were told would not open. She had already called the courthouse before arriving. A clerk put us on the emergency docket for the afternoon. She had the petition printed and clipped and tabbed. She had a small folder for each point I had recorded. Forged signature, utility account change, witness note about locks, pattern of financial control. She showed me the order of the tabs and said, "When I say tab 3, you nod because it is your witness in your house." I nodded. I felt my hands wanting to shake and told them to be still. We left the room together. The hall smelled like lemon cleaner and warm cereal. A nurse glanced up from a chart and froze as if the air had shifted, and she could not explain why. At the front desk, Monica asked for the administrator. He came out with his hands in his pockets like a boy called to the office. She laid the packet on the counter and stated the title of the petition. Emergency motion to revoke any claimed authority and to enjoin further interference. He began to say words like procedure and policy. Monica lifted one hand, and the words fell off his mouth like rain slipping from a gutter. She said, "We will not be debating hallway policy today. We are here to put you on notice and to collect my client's personal property." He signed the receipt with a pen that clicked nervously. Outside, the air had the soft weight that means rain is close. We drove to her office with the windows up and the silence working for us. In the passenger seat, I opened the notebook and read through my own handwriting like a compass. The dates did not wobble. The names held. When I closed it, I had the feeling a person gets when they draw breath before lifting something heavy and know the lift will happen. Monica's office was neat without being cold. Books in straight rows, framed certificates on the wall, but nothing ostentatious. She cleared a space at the center of the table and began to build the architecture of our first strike. She stacked certified copies of my ID and prior legal documents. She slid the nursing home admissions packet beside them and stuck a bright tab at the page where someone had written my name the way a stranger imagines it looks. She placed the utility bill with its denial of my existence on top like a headline. Then she pulled out a crisp pleading with my name across the caption. She read every line aloud, not as a performance but as confirmation that the words were the right ones. When she finished, she turned the document toward me and tapped the signature line. "Sign here, Margaret." This begins the unraveling. I took the pen and placed its tip on the line. My hand did what it has done for decades. It wrote my name without apology. Monica lifted a heavy stamp from a drawer, the kind that makes its own sound, and brought it down on the top copy with a firm motion. The red impression spread clean. Revoked. The mark looked almost beautiful against the black ink, like a wound that had decided to heal on its own terms. She watched my face. "Do you want to go nuclear?" I lifted my eyes to hers. "No. Biblical." She let out a small breath that could have been a laugh and could have been respect. Then she moved. She filed the petition electronically and called the clerk again. She sent copies to the nursing home and to their counsel if they had any. She drafted a short demand letter to the bank's legal department, asking for an immediate hold on transactions linked to my name pending review. She layers details the way a mason lays brick and mortar. Nothing dramatic. Everything exact. The pace of the day shifted from preparation to execution. Calls bounced back. The court confirmed an emergency hearing time. The nursing home acknowledged receipt and walked back from the language that had sounded so confident yesterday. The bank placed a provisional freeze on the joint account that my husband and I had opened 20 years ago, and that I had allowed Daniel to access a decade later when trust felt like breathing. What Daniel had not calculated was that my name still opened and closed that door. While Monica stayed on with the bank, I scanned my notebook for numbers and dates and handwritten notes from old statements. She placed the call on speaker. A man from fraud prevention read scripted lines about protecting customers. Monica interrupted gently and pointed him toward the docket number of our filing. He went quiet for a moment. He returned with a voice that had shifted into care. "We have frozen the funds associated with these recent transfers pending verification. They will not clear without your explicit authorization, Mrs. Hayes." Hearing my name spoken in a tone that recognized me as owner rather than object made something in my chest lift its head. I thanked him in a voice that did not shake. After the call, Monica pressed her forefinger to the table as if punctuating a sentence. "He will learn about this before dinner. Let him." In my mind, I could see his kitchen, the glass of wine he favored, the way he leaned against the counter when he felt pleased with himself. I imagined the notification on his phone. Transfer declined. The small confusion blooming into irritation, then into a colder thought he had not planned on having. My mother is not as finished as I told myself she was. We drove to the courthouse under a sky that had started to spit. The building was brick and patient. Inside, the air held the dry smell of paper and old wood. The clerk behind the window recognized Monica by name, which told me what I needed to know about how many people she had carried through the doors. She slid the stamped copies back to us with a glance that said she knew a story when she saw one. In the anteroom outside the judge's chambers, Monica explained what would happen in plain words. We would present the petition and the exhibits. We would request a temporary restraining order preventing Daniel from exercising any claimed authority. We would ask the nursing home to refrain from any restriction that suggests I am not competent. We would frame it not as family conflict, but as legal correction. She smoothed a page with the side of her hand. "You will answer if spoken to. You will not argue. You will stand in your truth and let the documents do the work." We went in when we were called. Time did its odd thing of stretching and tightening at once. The judge listened without fuss. Monica's sentences were straight lines, the admissions packet. The signature does not match. The utility account that stripped her client's name. The witness noted the changed locks. The bank action has just been confirmed. The pattern is of control, not care. My client is competent. My client has been displaced from her own home and placed in a facility without consent. We ask for immediate revocation and for an order preserving the status quo of her assets. Opposing counsel did not appear. Daniel had not retained one. The judge looked over his glasses at the bright red stamp on our exhibit. He asked me to state my name and age. I did. He asked if I understood the nature of the proceedings. I said I did. He asked if I had consented to the admission. I said I had not. He nodded the way people nod when a puzzle piece clicks. He signed the order with a pen that weighed it. In the hallway, Monica allowed herself a small exhale. She handed me a copy of the signed order. I held it with both hands. The seal at the bottom was pressed deep enough to feel. The red stamp on the exhibit looked louder under the fluorescent light. Revoked. I wanted to frame it and hang it above my old mantle. I wanted it to be the first thing someone saw when they walked into my house and the last thing they saw when they left. We stopped by her office again to scan everything and send it to the nursing home and to the bank, and to an address that belonged to Daniel so that no one could claim ignorance. Monica drafted a short letter to accompany the order. The letter was the opposite of emotional, and that was its power. It was a door that closed with a clean latch. Late afternoon, the rain finally came. We drove back to the facility because I had 2 small items to collect and because Monica wanted to hand the administrator a copy of the signed order personally. On the way, I thought of my mother. She used to say that some knives are not made of metal. She meant words. She meant truth. She meant the kinds of edges that cut only what needs cutting. I watched the wipers clear the glass and considered how the law can be that kind of edge when it is used correctly. Inside the administrator's office, the fluorescent light flickered once, then steadied. Monica placed the briefcase on the desk with the same finality she had used the day she first walked into my room. She opened it and withdrew the order and the exhibit with the red mark. She slid them across the desk. His eyes tracked the lines and widened a fraction at the stamp. He looked like a man learning a language he had thought he already spoke. Monica said, "We will be checking my client out today." He reached for a form and then thought better of it. There was nothing left to authorize. I walked back down the hall one last time. A woman in a wheelchair called for someone who did not come. A television in a lounge murmured at a volume set for people whose ears had more past than future. I stepped into my old room and rested my hand on the plastic headboard. The curtain moved against my sleeve just enough to register. I whispered thank you to a space that had tried to keep me small and had failed. I picked up the sweater and the photo of my husband and slid the notebook into my bag. We did not say goodbye to anyone at the desk. Goodbye felt like a word for places that had meant something good. We pushed through the front doors into rain that had grown serious. The sky was a single gray sheet. The parking lot shone like a mirror. Monica held the door with her shoulder so I could step out without rushing. We walked to the car with water pattering on our coats and the kind of silence that belongs to people who have done what they came to do. In the car, I watched the building get smaller in the rearview mirror. My reflection in the glass looked steadier than it had in weeks. The raincloth sound of the wipers and the low hum of the engine made a kind of music. I thought of Daniel. I thought of how he would be discovering the freeze on the account. I pictured his jaw set in that way he has when he refuses to admit a mistake. I pictured the flicker in his eyes when he realizes control has a cost. The phone buzzed in Monica's console. She pulled to the curb and put it on speaker. A bank supervisor confirmed that the transfers would not process and that alerts had been placed on the account. He addressed me directly and asked if I wished to change passwords and remove authorized users. I said yes. My voice sounded like a line drawn across a map. He sent temporary credentials to Monica's secure email. We would finish the steps from her office. We hung up, and there was a quiet minute where neither of us spoke. The quiet did not feel empty. It felt earned. We drove then with no hurry. The rain softened and gathered again and softened. I let my head rest against the seat and felt the kind of tired that used to arrive after long shifts when the work had been honest and the floor finally mopped and the lights turned out. This tired held satisfaction. It did not taste like defeat. It tasted like the first bite of bread after a long fast. At a red light, Monica glanced over and said, "You did well." I answered that the papers had done most of the work. She said the papers only work when a person refuses to disappear. I closed my eyes and let that sentence sit inside me where hurt had been. When we reached the extended stay where she had booked a small suite for me, she parked under the awning and cut the engine. The rain came off the roof in ropes. We sat for a breath. I looked at the notebook in my lap. The cover had warped a little from the damp in the air. I opened it and wrote a new line with my pen balanced against the curve of the steering wheel. May 16. Emergency order granted. Authority revoked. Bank freeze in effect. Administrator notified. Leaving the facility. The scratch of the pen sounded louder than it should have in the small car. It felt ceremonial. It felt like the end of a chapter and the lean beginning of something that would not be rushed. I closed the notebook and held it as one might hold a passport. We got out and moved quickly through the rain to the door. The glass opened with a soft sigh, and the warm lobby air curled around us. Monica shook the water from her sleeves and said, "Tomorrow we set the next motion, partition sale." I answered yes because the word had begun to mean something new to me. It meant I was not done. It meant some steps could be taken one after the other until a house and a name and a life returned to their rightful coordinates. That night, as the rain kept tapping against the window, I sat at the small table with a paper cup of tea and the photo of my husband propped against the lamp. I told him quietly in my head that the first cut had been clean, that the knife we used was not steel but law. It had hurt less than I expected and satisfied more than I had hoped. I told him that tomorrow we would aim the next cut at the place that had been taken from me while I was still breathing. When I turned off the lamp, the room did not feel like a cell. It felt like a stop on a road I had chosen. In the dark, I could hear the hallway clock ticking beyond the door, and I smiled to myself because time had decided to stand on my side again. The rain slowed. My breathing matched it. Somewhere not far away, a car drove through a puddle, and the sound rose and faded like a curtain. The first strike had landed. It had made no splash for neighbors to gossip about. It had left no bruise anyone could point to. It left paper and stamps and orders and a change in the air that only people who pay attention can feel. That is enough for now. There will be days when noise is required. Today was the day for edges that do not gleam until they have finished their cut. When sleep came, it was not the heavy sleep of resignation. It was the kind that visits workers when the floor is clean, the tools are put away, and the ledger is balanced. In the last thought before I dropped under, I told myself again the line I had been repeating since the day Daniel slid me into that beige room. The law can be sharper than any knife. If you carry it correctly, it will not cut you. It will cut only what needs to be divided. Outside, the rain returned and beat its soft hands against the window. Inside the room, the clock kept its honest counting. Tomorrow would belong to the next step. Tonight belonged to breathing. I have lived in that house longer than I have lived anywhere else, longer even than the years I shared with my husband before his passing. Its walls hold the sound of Daniel's first laugh, the echoes of his footsteps running down the hall in shoes I had worked double shifts to buy, and the smell of Sunday dinners that stretched a small roast into a feast because I seasoned it with patience and hunger. I used to spend evenings on my knees scrubbing the floors until they shone, my back aching, my palms raw from bleach. I remember staring at those wooden boards and telling myself, this house will not slip away from me, no matter what it costs. Once, when the mortgage was months behind, I slipped off my wedding ring, heavy with years, and walked into a pawn shop that smelled of cold metal. The clerk weighed my ring like it was nothing more than scrap. I took the bills he handed me and carried them home, whispering into the empty kitchen that it was worth it if Daniel never knew we almost lost the roof over our heads. Those sacrifices live in every corner of that house. Every chipped tile is a story. Every nail hammered into the walls carries the echo of late-night prayers asking God to let me keep it, just a little longer, until the boy had grown. And now, that same boy thought he could sign it over to himself, as if sweat and sacrifice were transferable assets. When Monica told me we had the emergency order in hand, she said the next step was the house. She spread out the deed on her desk, the paper yellowed at the edges from time, but still carrying the clear print of ownership. She tapped the section where my name sat alone, steady, untouched. It has never been transferred legally, Margaret. You are still the owner, no quitclaim deed. No sale, no lawful conveyance. I stared at the paper, my heart thudding like a drum in my chest. After everything they had done, the forged admissions, the locked doors, the stripped bills, the house still belonged to me. It was my in-law, not just in memory. The betrayal was deep, but the truth was deeper. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake thinking about the house as if it were a living thing calling me back. I pictured its porch light, the one that flickered every third evening and that I never managed to fix because other bills always came first. I pictured the window of the kitchen where I had watched Daniel ride his bike down the street for the first time, my breath caught between fear and pride. And I pictured it now, with lights glowing behind curtains I did not choose, with voices filling the rooms that had once been mine. The next morning, Monica drove us past it. We didn't stop, but from the car window I saw the silhouette of the home I had fought to keep all those years. There was a light on in the living room. For a moment, it looked warm, but then I realized it wasn't the warmth of family. It was the cold glow of occupancy without ownership. The sight pressed against my chest like a stone. That house was the altar where I had laid down pieces of myself, and now strangers in my own blood sat inside, drinking from glasses I had bought, using spoons that once stirred Daniel's childhood soup. I whispered, more to myself than to Monica, "You mean the house you threw me out of?" She glanced at me but said nothing, letting the words sit heavy in the air. We drove on, but the image of that light stayed with me. It followed me into sleep that night and into the next morning when Monica set the papers on the table in front of me. "Partition sales," she said, her finger tapping the top of the form. "It's the cleanest way. They're occupying it without the right. You remain the sole legal owner. You can force a sale, and every cent comes to you." My hands rested on the pen. I thought of every sacrifice folded into those walls, every hour spent keeping the lights on, every tear shed quietly in the kitchen sink. I thought of the smell of Daniel's hair when he was small and used to fall asleep against me in that living room. My heart ached with the weight of love and betrayal woven together. Then I tightened my grip, because love is not ownership, but sacrifice is, and sacrifice written into mortgages, pawned rings, and cracked hands deserves recognition. The pacing of my heartbeat matched the ticking of the clock on the wall, slow at first, then faster, louder, as I realized the power in my hands. I was not only reclaiming my house, I was declaring that what had been stolen in lies would be restored in truth. I lifted the pen. My hand trembled, but not with doubt, with resolve. Slowly, deliberately, I signed my name on the partition sale documents. The ink shone wet for a moment, then settled into the fibers of the paper like roots gripping soil. When I looked up, Monica smiled faintly. "That's it, the process begins." I pressed my palm against the page, feeling the weight of the ink beneath it. In that moment, I wasn't just Margaret Hayes, the woman they had called a burden. I was Margaret Hayes, the rightful owner, the woman whose name was written into the foundation of that house and now into the future of its fate. Later that afternoon, we walked out of the courthouse. The sky was overcast, but the air felt lighter. I carried my copy of the signed motion pressed against my chest. It bore the official seal, the raised imprint I could feel beneath my fingertips. The paper seemed to pulse with life. It was proof that truth could not be erased by forgery. As we reached the car, I turned once more to Monica. "No one can take away the home you bled to keep," I said quietly, almost to myself. The rain began to fall as I slid into the seat, the drops running down the window like the tears I no longer needed to shed. We drove away from the courthouse, and though the house itself was still filled with their shadows, the law had spoken. The light glowing in its windows belonged not to them, but to me. At exactly 7 in the morning, the process server arrived at the house I had bled to keep, the house where Daniel and Vanessa now lived like squatters draped in entitlement. I wasn't there to see it with my own eyes, but Monica's investigator gave me every detail, and I savored it the way someone savors a long-awaited meal. The knock on the door was sharp, businesslike, 3 quick raps that carried through the hallway. Vanessa opened it first, still in her robe, mascara smudged under her eyes from a late night of wine and performance. She saw the man in the plain suit holding a thick envelope and froze. When he said her name and held the documents out, she shrieked so loudly that neighbors stepped onto their porches. Daniel came running down the hall, his face draining of color as he saw the bold lettering at the top. Petition for partition sale. I imagined his jaw tightening, his breath catching as if a hand had wrapped around his throat. The investigator said Vanessa threw the packet onto the floor, shouting about humiliation, betrayal, and unfairness. Daniel's face turned the kind of red that isn't strength but shame. He kicked the envelope across the floor, but the pages scattered anyway. He could not stuff them back into silence. While they were unraveling, I sat with Monica in her office. She handed me a copy of the affidavit of service, proof that the law had entered the house they thought they owned. She poured me coffee and said softly, "The truth doesn't need to scream. It just knocks, and you answer or you don't." I let the warmth of the cup soak into my hands. For the first time in months, I felt like the house itself had spoken back to them, saying, "You may sit inside me, but you are not mine." The pace of the days that followed was taut, quick, every hour bringing a new move. Daniel called Monica's office 3 times in one day, leaving messages dripping with desperation. He used words like misunderstanding and family matter. Monica didn't flinch. She filed every message under evidence. Vanessa, on the other hand, went loud. She stormed onto the front porch one afternoon, yelling at the neighbors about betrayal, about how I had abandoned her husband, about how none of this was fair. The neighbors listened quietly, some shaking their heads. By evening, whispers traveled down the block. What Daniel and Vanessa didn't know was that Monica had already lined up potential buyers. She wanted no delay, no room for them to maneuver. A week later, she invited me to meet a young couple who had been searching for their first home. They were newly married, Black, and both teachers in the local school district. They walked through the house with reverence, touching the banister, smiling at the kitchen window as if it had been waiting for them. I watched them carefully. The way they spoke to each other was filled with respect, soft but certain. In that moment, I saw something that had been missing for years. Love for the walls, the rooms, the soul of the place. Not entitlement, not greed, real care. When we stepped outside into the evening light, the wife turned to me and said, "This house wants to be loved again." I felt tears prick my eyes. "Homes deserve love, not theft," I whispered. They made a full cash offer by the end of that week. Monica moved swiftly, her pen scratching across contracts, her tone leaving no space for protest. When Daniel tried to stall, claiming sentimental value, the court reminded him that he had no legal standing. Vanessa screamed in the hallway of the courthouse, her voice bouncing against marble walls, but the judge only raised an eyebrow. The twist that sealed everything came not from paperwork but from presence. On the day of closing, I stood across from that young couple at the lawyer's conference table. Papers stacked neatly, pens ready, and the smell of fresh ink in the air. We signed each page, my hand steady, theirs eager. At the end, we all stood, and I extended my hand. The husband clasped it firmly, the wife covering both our hands with hers. The sun through the office window poured gold across the table, catching on our joined hands. It felt like the house itself exhaled, finally free. That handshake under the fading light was not just a contract, it was a transfer of dignity. I gave them the keys not just to a structure but to a history, and they promised, without words, to treat it with the respect it had long been denied. Later that evening, I walked back through the empty rooms one final time. The echoes of footsteps seemed softer, as if even the house knew it was moving toward peace. I touched the kitchen counter where I had kneaded bread with aching arms. I paused at the living room window where I had once watched Daniel come home from school, backpack too large for his shoulders. Shadows stretched across the floor, long and forgiving. As I closed the door, the sound of the latch carried into the space. It was not just the closing of wood and metal. It was the echo of years folding themselves into silence, leaving only the truth behind. The house no longer carried their shadows. It carried hope. Walking away, I held my copy of the sale agreement close to me. The seal glimmered faintly under the streetlight. A piece of paper, yes, but also a sword drawn clean. Justice can wear many shapes. That night, it wore the shape of a contract, signed and sealed. And as I stepped into Monica's car, the door closed with a firm click, and I knew this chapter was done. Some would call it revenge. I called it restoration. Because no one can steal the foundation you bled to keep. They can only borrow time until truth knocks at their door. Daniel called in the middle of an ordinary afternoon when the light through the blinds lay quiet stripes across my kitchen table, and the kettle had just begun to whisper. His voice carried that careful polish he uses when he wants to sound like a son again. He said he wished we could meet for dinner and talk like family. He spoke of starting over, of finding a way to be civil, of clearing the air so everyone could sleep. I let him pour words until the silence between us grew heavy. Then I said yes. I said it softly, the way one agrees to weather that is already rolling in from the horizon. I chose a navy dress I had kept tucked away even during the loneliest weeks. The zipper caught for a second, and I laughed to myself at the small resistance of fabric that still remembered the shape of my back. I pinned my hair with the same deliberate hands that had once tied Daniel's shoelaces and smoothed his collar on picture day. Monica told me I did not owe him another evening. She said the filings were strong and the sale was complete, and the next legal steps would hold. I thanked her and told her I was going anyway. Some reckonings are not written on paper. Some need a table and plates, and the weight of the forks. The restaurant sat on a corner where the sidewalks were always swept, and a single tree wore little lights that glowed even before dusk. Inside the room was all glass and silver, and the softness of linen that insists on good behavior. The hostess led me to a long table set with clear water in small glasses and knives that reflected the ceiling lamps in clean lines. I slid into my chair and folded my hands. The air held a faint sweetness of butter and something citrus. I listened to the steady sound of conversation from nearby tables, the clink and pause of strangers handling their own evenings. I waited. Daniel and Vanessa arrived together, as if a synchronized entrance might rewrite our history. He wore a jacket that was one size too small and a tie pulled high, as if certainty could be knotted. Vanessa had painted her mouth into a smile and balanced it with pearl earrings that dangled just enough to sway when she tilted her head. They kissed the air near my cheek and sat across from me, Daniel with his shoulders squared, Vanessa arranging her napkin into a tidy triangle. For a while we discussed the weather and the traffic, and which corner of the room had the best light for photos. It was the kind of conversation you have when no one is ready to say the thing that dragged you out of your house in the first place. The server brought bread that cracked under my fingers and a dish of olive oil, with flecks of green herbs and a little salt that shone like frost. Vanessa mentioned a fundraiser at the school and how hard it was to coordinate volunteers. Daniel asked if the extended stay where I was living felt quiet. He was trying to sound thoughtful. His eyes gave him away. They kept flicking to the door as if escape were something he could still order from the hallway. Soup arrived. Warm steam rose and curved into the light. I watched it lift and vanish and thought about all the soups I had once cooled by blowing gently across a spoon for a boy who would not wait. Vanessa cleared her throat and told me she was sorry for the way things looked. She said she had been emotional and that social media had turned neighbors into judges. She wanted to call what happened a misunderstanding. I let the word sit between us without a chair to hold it. It slid to the floor and stayed there. Daniel took a breath and began the performance he had practiced. He spoke about fear. He said he worried about me losing track of things and about houses that needed constant maintenance and about bills that did not care whether someone had a headache or a bad week. He said he acted fast because he thought it was safer than doing nothing. He wanted me to see his rush as protection. He wanted the panic he lived in to feel like love. I rested my spoon. The porcelain tapped the rim, and the sound reached further than it should have. I kept my voice level. My eyes did not leave his. I repeated the line that had sat in my chest like a stone waiting for a hand. You called me a burden. Tonight I call you forgotten. The room fell inward. Plates paused at other tables. Vanessa's practiced smile lost its glue. Daniel blinked hard as if he could dislodge what he had just heard. His mouth opened on a half-formed word and closed again. He had come expecting noise. He wanted a scene that would make me small. He wanted to point at my temper and tell himself it was proof. He had not prepared for quiet. The server arrived with the main course, as if unaware that something had just shifted the air. Chicken carved into precise pieces. Potatoes with edges browned from the heat of the pan. Soft green beans that snapped clean between my teeth when I tried one to prove I could still taste. We ate in a rhythm that was not a rhythm at all. Vanessa cut her meat into perfect squares and then moved them around as if arranging tiles. Daniel drank water like a man who had forgotten how to swallow. He started again with the pleading voice some men save for judges and mothers. He said he made mistakes, but he did not mean harm. He said he panicked when he saw the mortgage notices and the rising costs of everything, and the headlines about elders being scammed, and the long list of what-ifs that keep a mind up at night. He asked me to understand that he was only trying to keep the worst from happening. I folded my napkin across my lap and touched its edge with my fingertip, as if tracing a map back to myself. I spoke quietly so he would have to lean forward and hear every word. I told him I had kept the worst from happening in his entire life. I told him there were nights when I put water in soup to stretch it, and mornings when I walked to work because gas had to go in the car he used to get to school. I told him that when I sold my wedding band to meet the mortgage payment, I had not asked anyone to praise me for my judgment. I asked only that the roof did not move. Vanessa tried to interrupt. She said we were all tired. She suggested a truce. She spoke about family pictures and holiday plans and how gossip moves like mold in old houses. I looked at her, and then I looked at the cake that had been set down in the center of the table by a server who had probably been told the moment required something sweet. It was a careful thing with high frosting and a circle of berries bright as little hearts. No one touched it. The light from above shone on its smooth surface. It looked exactly like a promise no one would keep. Daniel picked up his knife and set it down, and picked it up again. His hand could not decide whether to cut or surrender. He said he wanted to fix it. He said he could meet me halfway. He said we would sell the house together, and he would make sure I had a room in whatever place he chose for me. He said Monica was making things worse. He said the court did not understand how families work. He said a lot. Every sentence was a plank on a bridge he was building over his own behavior. None of them reached me. I kept my voice even. I said the house was sold. I said a young couple would be moving in soon, and that I had looked into their eyes and seen respect. I said the funds were mine by right, and that I planned to live without anyone checking my keys. I told him I had updated my will. I said that when the day comes, the things I own will go where they are needed and where they will be handled with clean hands. I watched the words land and stay. He tried a softer tactic then. He spoke about childhood, about how he remembered being scared of thunderstorms and how I sat on the couch and counted between lightning and thunder to measure distance until the storm moved away. He asked if I remembered the game. He asked if I remembered singing while we waited. He asked if I could make that kind of waiting happen here. He wanted nostalgia to erase paperwork. He wanted memory to eat evidence. I let the silence answer him. It grew thick. It filled the space where excuses live. Vanessa shifted in her chair and stared at the cake like it might blink. Somewhere nearby, cutlery chimed against glass, and a small burst of laughter rose from a group by the window and broke against our table without touching us. He said my name then, not Mama. Not Mom, the full name as if distance were a charm. He asked me to forgive him. He asked for a path back. He asked for anything that could be called hope. My eyes did not soften. I have learned that mercy is not the same as forgetting. I have learned that an apology is not the same as repair. I let the quiet stand there at the head of the table like a judge with an unimpressed face. I turned my attention to the cake. It was beautiful in the way careful things are beautiful, but it carried no truth. The server hovered and asked if we would like it sliced. I shook my head. Not tonight. The words surprised me with their calm. The server nodded and drifted away. The cake stayed right where it was. The light on it made a small circle that reflected in Daniel's water glass. Vanessa reached for Daniel's hand. He pulled it away and rubbed his temple. For a second, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who would not look at me when he had broken something he could not glue. Then the boy vanished, and the man returned, the man who had called me a burden and made his voice sound like concern while he did it. The room gave a small shiver as someone opened the door to the street, and a cool draft ran along the floor and touched our ankles like a warning. I stood. Chairs do not usually sound like thunder when they move. Mine did tonight. I placed my napkin beside my plate and smoothed it as if it were a curtain drawn at the end of a performance. I looked at Daniel and Vanessa. I felt no need to explain anything more. I had spoken enough. The rest belonged to them, to whatever echo would move through their rooms when they tried to sleep. I walked past the cake and past the careful lights and past a wall of framed photographs of fishermen holding up silver things that caught the sunday. At the door, the host stepped aside with a small bow. I stepped into the evening. The cool air wrapped me the way a cloak wraps a queen. The sky held the last thin line of color along the edge of the buildings. A bus hissed at the curb, and a couple hurried past, laughing at something that had nothing to do with me. I let the night put its hand on my shoulder and guide me forward. Behind me, plates clinked and voices stitched themselves back together around other tables. At mine, a frosted circle waited without purpose. It would be boxed and sent away or scraped into the trash, and the sweetness would blur into water. I did not think about it again. I thought about the way my feet felt sure on the sidewalk. I thought about the small ring of keys in my bag that belonged only to me now. I thought about the next morning and the work of living. I did not rush. I let my steps find their own music. I passed stores that had already darkened their windows and a florist who was taking buckets inside one by one. The petals toppled gently with each lift and settled again as if taught how to tolerate motion. A woman in a red coat stood outside the bakery checking her phone. Somewhere, a dog barked twice and then decided against a third try. The ordinary insisted on itself, and I welcomed it like an old friend coming back after a long sulk. I reached the corner and waited for the light, and crossed with a small group of strangers who did not know they were sharing a moment with the end of a story. The pavement smelled faintly of rain from the morning. My breath came even. My mind felt clear. I slipped my hand into my bag and touched the edges of my notebook. I did not need to open it tonight. Some things are better held with the palm rather than the eye. When I reached the car, I sat for a moment and watched the restaurant through the glass. A server lifted the untouched cake and carried it away, careful hands balancing a thing that looked like a celebration but tasted of nothing. The door closed behind him. The room swallowed him whole. I started the engine and drove home at a sensible speed. I obeyed every light. I smiled once at a child in the back seat of a car beside me who was singing to himself without caring who heard. At home, the quiet welcomed me. I set water to boil and placed a tea bag in a cup with a small chip on the rim from a winter when dishes were colder than my hands. I sat at the table and let the steam soften the air above my face. I did not replay the dinner. I did not compose speeches I might have said. I let the silence do the work it had been born to do. People think punishment is fire. Sometimes it is frost. Tonight it was the kind of frost that traces delicate lines across a window and leaves the world visible while reminding you there is glass. My silence drew those lines. He will see through them tomorrow and the day after. He will see his reflection there. He will learn. I finished my tea and washed the cup and set it upside down to dry. I turned off the lamp and stood in the doorway of my small living room and listened to the low hum of a refrigerator that keeps honest time. I thought of my husband for a breath and told him the table had served its purpose. The night did not answer and did not need to. In bed, I lay on my side and watched the shadows shift across the ceiling as cars passed outside. I thought of the cake once more and then let it vanish. I thought of Daniel's face when the room went quiet. I thought of the way an apology can lose its bones when truth stands up. I pulled the blanket to my shoulder and exhaled. The word that rested in my chest was not revenge. It was balanced. Silence carries weight when it is earned. Mine is heavy enough to leave a mark. I felt it settle. I felt it hold. And I slept without dreams. Monica set the folder on her desk, and the room went still in that particular way. Offices do when decisions enter, and refuse to leave quietly. Morning light slipped through the blinds and drew pale bars across the polished wood. I could hear a faint ticking from the wall clock and the soft pull of her breath as she slid the paperwork toward me. "This is your will," she said, and her voice carried both gravity and gentleness. I rested my fingertips on the top page and felt the coolness of the paper against my skin. It was not just a document. It was a map of where what I have will go when I am gone, and a mirror of who I have become while I am still here. I read line by line, lips moving silently, every clause a small bridge to a new shoreline. Daniel was no longer there. The old assumptions I had walked around with for years had been lifted and set aside. In their place, I found Tyler, written with care and protected by provisions that would hold him steady until he learned how to stand without leaning on anyone's desperation. Further down the page, I found the grant I had asked Monica to build with the community center. The name looked simple on paper, and yet it held the weight of so many kitchens and back bedrooms and borrowed couches. The Mayfield Legacy Grant. Money to cover legal consultations, temporary housing, transportation, whatever it takes to keep older women from being boxed and labeled the way I was. I traced a line under those words with the pad of my finger and felt an old kind of ache ease inside my chest. I signed where Monica pointed, and each signature rested on the page like a small anchor. When I finished, she lifted the heavy seal and pressed it into warm red wax. The stamp made a soft sound, and the impression set quickly. She slipped everything into a thick envelope and cooled the wax with a steady breath. When she handed it to me, it felt heavier than I expected. I held it with both hands and allowed myself a long, quiet moment. For the first time in months, the future did not feel like a room someone else would decorate. I walked home the long way to keep calm. The late afternoon air carried the clean smell that follows a light rain, and shop windows along the street held reflections of passing faces. At the corner bakery, a woman laughed and held a paper bag to her chest as if it were a treasure. A bus sighed, doors opening and closing with the weary rhythm of a city that has learned how to keep moving. I climbed the steps to my place and set the envelope on the dining table. Beside it, I placed my husband's photograph in its simple wooden frame. He looked like himself, the gentle tilt of his mouth at the edge of a smile he rarely wasted. I lit a short candle and let the small flame settle the room. I told him the news aloud, not because I believed he could answer, but because saying it let its truth steady in me. "The boy we raised is not written here," I said. "The child who listens and helps me carry the groceries is. The rest will go where it can become shelter for women who have been told their lives are too heavy to hold." The candle flickered, and a small shimmer of light crossed the glass over his face. I touched the envelope again and felt the raised ring of the seal under my fingertip. The color looked almost alive. Days gathered into a softer rhythm after that. I woke early and walked in the park. I found a bench near a little grove of maples and watched dogs pull their people in happy circles. I carried a notebook, not the one of evidence, a new one, and wrote down what I noticed. A girl in a yellow coat is learning how to keep the ends of her scarf out of her tea. A man practicing a speech under his breath, hands making quiet shapes, the way the wind moved the leaves in different directions at once and still somehow made a single music. It felt like a class in breathing. When I met with the director of the community center to finalize the grant details, she spread a calendar on the table, and we mapped out clinics and rides, and office hours. She asked me if I wanted my name anywhere on the materials. I told her I wanted it sutured into the fabric but not stitched on top. If the project helps, that will be enough. She nodded and wrote a note in tidy script. We walked the hallway, and she showed me the room where a lawyer would sit twice a week, the corner where a social worker would take calls, and the modest cupboard where extra blankets and grocery cards would be kept. I imagined a woman stepping through that door, with her shoulders braced against the judgment of strangers, and leaving with a sheet of paper in her hand that restored her like a hot meal. I packed the envelope into a small wooden box that used to hold recipes I never had time to try. I placed the box beneath the framed photograph and set a clean cloth over both. In the evening, I made a simple supper and ate at the table without rushing. It is not easy to get used to the quiet after the years I filled every minute with work. Now the quiet came with a chair for me, and I learned how to sit. The call from Daniel arrived at twilight, the hour when the sky still holds a pale stripe at the edge and the corners of rooms begin to soften. He did not waste time. He asked if I had truly done this thing, if his name was gone, if I had replaced him with a teenager in a building that smells like coffee and old paint. The anger in his voice tripped over something raw. I answered plainly, "Yes, it is done." He started with the arguments I knew by heart. I was his only parent. People act badly under stress. He was afraid. Vanessa had a way of making a small fear into a large fire. The world is expensive. The past is heavy. He said he could correct what had happened. He said he would hire help and schedule doctors, and sell what needed selling. He said he would move me into a nice apartment where I would not have to worry, not that I ever should have worried. He said he was sorry. He said it again in a smaller voice. I listened to the long spool of his words without tugging on it. Then I said the sentence I had saved for this night. Forgiveness does not mean inheritance. I gave the sentence time to stand by itself. He went quiet. I could hear the steady sound of his breath and the small catch it made in the middle, as if it had bumped over a stone. He asked me if I hated him. I told him no. Hate is a fire that burns the hand that holds it. I am finished setting myself on fire to keep anyone warm. He told me he could not understand how a mother could do this to a son. I told him I could not understand how a son could take a mother's signature and make it a lie, how a son could change the locks and tell the neighbors she was slipping when he was the one losing his footing. I did not raise my voice. I put each word where it belonged and left it there. He said my name one more time, and I let the silence answer him. He hung up without a goodbye. I sat with the phone on the table and looked at the candle's small flame. I did not feel triumphant. I felt firm. There is a difference. I breathed in and let the air go, and said to the empty room, "The path is drawn. I will not drag him down. He will walk if he chooses." Later that week, he came to my door. The knock was tentative, the kind people use when they are unsure which version of you will open. I did not keep him waiting. He stood on the step as if he had grown taller since morning and did not trust his legs. His face was thinner than I remembered, his eyes set deeper. He asked if he could come in. I told him we could speak on the porch. The air felt kind, and the porch light made a soft circle on the boards between us. He started again with explanations, then veered into memory. He told me he remembered the smell of Sunday bread and the way I used to hum while I washed dishes. He said he remembered me fixing the back of his shirt before a school photo and the way I cut his meat when he broke his wrist. He said he missed that house. He said he missed me. He asked if there was any way to restore the will. I shook my head. I told him the will is not a weather vane. It does not spin because the wind has changed direction. It points where it is meant to point. He tried one last turn. He said he had talked to a counselor. He said the counselor told him to ask for a probation of sorts. He offered to handle my errands and help me with rides and bring groceries once a week. He asked me to believe that this time would be different. I folded my hands and let them rest in my lap. I told him he could choose to show up for the work of being a man without being paid for it in advance. I wished him well with the counselor. I told him to go home. He surprised me by crying. Not loud, not theatrical, not the kind of crying that demands an audience. His shoulders moved once and then again, and he turned his head and stared into the street as if the blacktop had written a message he could learn by heart. I waited. When he looked back at me, his face was calmer. He thanked me for listening, almost like a stranger might thank a nurse. Then he walked down the steps and kept going without looking back. That night I dreamed I was standing at the edge of a wide field, stubble under my shoes, the smell of dry grass in the air. In my hand, I held a red envelope, and across the field walked a line of women with paper in their palms and keys on rings, and small photographs tucked into old wallets. We met in the middle and exchanged nothing but nods. In the morning, the dream still felt true. Monica called to confirm the filing was complete, and the copies had been logged, and the notifications sent. She asked if I was all right. I said I was more than all right. I was settled. She laughed softly and told me that settled is a word most clients do not find until a year after their case closes. I told her I have had practice living with consequences. We scheduled a small appointment at the bank to finish the last security steps, and then we were done. I took the bus to the community center for the first information session attached to the grant. I sat in the back row to watch the shape of the hour. A woman with silver hair and a lavender cardigan asked how a person proves a signature is false when the family insists otherwise. A man at the end of the row sat with a woman who kept her hands locked together and stared down at the rug. The lawyer answered with plain steps and a gentle manner. At the end, I stopped by the director's office and left a check for the next phase. It did not feel like generosity. It felt like housekeeping. As the sun went down, I walked home and paused at the small store that sells flowers in buckets on the sidewalk. I chose a handful of red roses and carried them the way one carries good news. On the porch, I cut the stems and slipped them into a jar. The petals caught the last warm light of the day and held it for a breath before releasing it back to the air. Inside, I set the jar beside the photograph and the wooden box. The candle flame dipped when I passed and then steadied. I stood for a long minute looking at that small arrangement. A man who believed in me. A sealed envelope that will outlast my hands. Flowers that open whether anyone watches or not. I said the sentence that has become the hinge on which my heart now turns. Forgiveness is for the heart, but justice is for the future. If a camera had been there, it would have moved slowly across the table and found each element in order. The envelope with its firm red seal. The photograph is in its plain frame. The roses with a thin ring of water lifted their scent. The flame, neither large nor timid, simply presents. Then the lens would have widened to include me, the woman who has learned to be both soft and exact. I turned off the overhead light, and the room glowed a moment longer from the candle and the reflections off the jar. I carried a cup of tea to the chair by the window and watched the street settle into the evening. A teenager rolled by on a skateboard, the wheels humming like an old fan. A neighbor in a blue jacket took in his trash can and waved without expecting anything in return. I waved back and went on watching. The phone stayed still on the table, no messages, no new demands. Only the low thrum of a refrigerator that sounded like an honest machine doing its one job well. I finished my tea and put the cup in the sink and ran a little water over it for the morning. I checked the lock on the front door, not from fear but from habit. I blew out the candle, and the small smoke ribbon curled upward and faded. In the dark, I touched the wooden box one last time and felt the cool grain under my palm. I slept without interruption. When dawn came, it found me before I opened my eyes. The window held a pale square, and birds practiced their brief songs. I thought of Tyler, how he has begun to ask questions with a new kind of patience in them. I thought of the women who would walk through the community center doors and of the counselors who would not ask them to prove their dignity before offering a chair. I thought of Daniel somewhere in a room learning the feel of quiet without the cushion of my approval. I wished him a clean morning and the courage to meet it. My day began with the usual small chores, and each one felt like a word in a sentence I finally understood. I have work left to do, and the work is ordinary, which is a blessing. There will be more papers someday. There will be new names on forms and a different key in the lock. I will not be here for all of it, yet I am here for this. The border around my life has been set, and no one is invited to redraw it. I opened the blinds, and the room filled with light. The seal on the envelope caught it and threw back a little spark. I smiled and let it stay. I unlocked the door to the little house with a key that was mine alone, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the air shift in my chest. It wasn't grand, it wasn't perfect, but it was free of ghosts. The siding was faded, the porch steps creaked when I stepped on them, and the windows needed washing, but all I saw was possibility. Across the narrow hedge stood the house Daniel and Vanessa still occupied, their curtains drawn more often now, their voices muted even when they argued. I hadn't bought this house out of spite, though some might believe it. I bought it because peace sometimes needs to sit directly in the line of sight of those who tried to take it from you. On my second morning, I went to the garden center and returned with a flat of young rose bushes, their stems thorny and their buds tight as secrets. I lined them along the fence one by one, digging the soil with hands that once scrubbed floors until the skin cracked. As I pressed the roots into the earth, I remembered pawning my wedding ring to buy Daniel's graduation suit, and I let that memory soak into the ground like water. These roses would not bloom for him. They would bloom for me. The pacing of my days slowed into something I could hold without trembling. Each morning, I watered the soil. Each evening, I sat on the porch and watched the sun slide low, brushing the tops of the bushes with gold. The neighborhood children stopped to ask what kind they were, and I told them they would be red, deep red, the kind that carries both love and warning. It didn't take long before Vanessa's patience cracked. I saw her one afternoon dragging a suitcase down their porch steps, her mouth tight, her eyes averted. She stuffed boxes into the trunk of a car and slammed it shut so hard the sound echoed down the street. Daniel stood on the porch, arms folded, saying nothing. She didn't look back. That was the twist the world delivered to them. She walked away without ceremony, and Daniel was left standing in silence, exactly the silence he had once sentenced me to. I did not gloat. I did not even smile. I simply sat with my cup of tea and let the quiet fold around me like a blanket. Some lessons don't need words. Some punishments arrive in the shape of absence. A week later, Tyler walked down the sidewalk after school, his backpack slung low. He hesitated at the gate, then pushed it open and stepped into my yard. He looked at the line of roses and said softly that the place already felt different. He asked if he could stay the night. I opened the door without asking questions. He stayed not just that night, but the next, and soon enough it became clear he had chosen. One evening, over dinner, he set his fork down and said, "This is home." I didn't correct him. I let the words settle in the air like a blessing. The roses began to bloom at the start of summer. They opened in bursts of crimson that caught the morning light and held it like fire. Neighbors complimented them. Children leaned in to smell them and pulled back quickly when the thorns pricked their curiosity. I trimmed them carefully, leaving enough to show that beauty and caution can live together. Daniel still lived across the fence. I saw him sometimes in the early hours, standing by his mailbox, staring at nothing. He never waved, never spoke, but I could feel his eyes slide toward the roses and the laughter of Tyler as he helped me tend them. He must have realized then that what he had tried to bury had not rotted. It had taken root. One quiet evening, Tyler asked me why I didn't shout at his father, why I didn't go over and tell him everything he deserved to hear. I looked at the boy who was becoming a man and told him the truth. Justice isn't loud, it's steady, and it lasts. He nodded slowly, as though the words had tied themselves into a knot he would keep in his pocket for later. If a camera had been there, it would have pulled back slowly, capturing the roses along the fence, red against the pale boards, their petals trembling in the evening air. Then it would have lifted to catch the pale sky turning brighter at the edges, a new day about to rise. I sat with Tyler beside me, the boy who still had time to choose differently, and I felt the kind of peace no verdict could deliver. Revenge had never been about destruction. It was about planting something that would outlast betrayal. The roses bloomed, and I let them stand as proof that love and justice, when tended carefully, can both flourish. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on screen.